So today we have 3 guests from Australia, and we are very excited to have you guys on. Thank you so much for joining us. So welcome everybody to Upstream Media. So today, we are live. Finally, we had some difficulties from Australia with 3 guests. And before I introduce our guests, I just want to shortly talk a little about Perth and West Australia. So everybody know where Perth and West Australia are and where it is and things. So Perth is the capital city of Western Australia, and it has a population of 2.6 million. And Western Australia is the largest state in Australia, but it's not as densely populated as most other places in there, like if you go on the east coast of Australia, like where Sydney and Melbourne. And when the lockdowns started, Australia, in the whole of Australia, Western Australia had like the zero COVID policy, just like rest of Australia, and had very strict border policies like closure, like in Victoria and New South Wales. And then, but then Western Australia kept really strict borders, where the other one loosened up a little on the strict borders. And then Western Australia, you haven't had much, many lockdowns, like days of lockdowns, and you haven't had many cases compared to like Sydney and Melbourne. So let's get this unique chance to hear from our 3 guests about how it is to live and work in Western Australia. And I'd like to welcome Owen and Rob and Danny. I don't know, Rob, Owen, can you two introduce yourself just with a few words if you want to? You just pick and
Okay, I'll start.
Okay.
So my name's Rob, and I'm a teacher in Perth. I've got a family. We live down near Fremantle, and I guess we've been watching the world with COVID, very isolated and removed from it up until this time, and it's only just starting to creep into our borders now. I'll let Owen introduce himself.
Yep.
Sure. Well, I'm a school teacher. I live in the very northern suburbs, in a place called Yanchep. It's by the sea. I drive for an hour inland to a fairly rural spot where I teach every day, and I don't know. We're isolated, so we're kind of like the people who have been able to sit and watch everybody else try and solve these problems, and I'm not sure whether we're really prepared in all the right ways for the next few weeks, but we'll see what happens.
Thank you. Danny?
Hi everyone, I'm Danny. I work as a filmmaker and a photographer, but I live right in the city. I live in Leederville. So we're really feeling it with the restaurants and so on around us. I have 3 children, 2 at university and 1 in high school. And it's been interesting for us.
Thank you. Some of you talked a little about here in your introduction, but like your experience, has there been a lot of fear in the general public about COVID-19? Like, what's your experience? Like, I don't know. Owen, will you start? Do you have any?
Yeah, well, I think there has been. I recall one time going into a pharmacy and I'd forgotten something, so I ran out to my car to grab it, and I came back in, and I didn't scan in for a second time, and a woman followed me around the shops. And eventually, I felt kind of weird about that. And eventually she confronted me. She came on and she said, "You didn't scan in." And I actually had scanned in. And this is in a state where like pretty much nobody had COVID. It didn't exist here. It was going crazy over east, but it wasn't here. So yeah, there was definitely some pretty irrational fear.
What is it that you're scanning? Is that an app on your phone?
Yes. So they're able to record everywhere we go with our with our COVID apps if we diligently use them.
Yeah.
I find just going like this seems to work quite well. I'm half joking.
For how long? How many months have you been scanning an app? Or had to do that in shops?
Oh, I don't know when it started.
Quite over a year.
All right. Yeah. What's your experience, Rob?
Well, yeah, it's tricky because, you know, we're relatively untouched in terms of having COVID. And there's different camps, you know, who some people say toughen up, but there's a lot of people that have been really deeply affected by the shutdowns, by you know, the lockdowns and the restrictions, and the movement that people can have if you're unvaccinated. I think it's had a big impact on retail and restaurants. So for a city or a state that has had almost zero COVID to this point, there's been a huge cost to a lot of people. And I guess just as an individual waiting for what is seemingly a tsunami that's going to hit us, we've been peppered from day one just with all of this information, this data on how many people are dying of COVID every day. In the early days, they were identifying every person that was getting it, what their jobs were before the vaccine.
By name as well?
In the early days, I think they were certainly identifying individuals, in the sector. And of course, as numbers picked up, they just started just referring to how many people had it that day. And every headline has the word fear in it. And so there's this really impending sense that, it's going to come and it's going to hit us and we're all going to be, well, we should be afraid. And I think there is cause certainly for fear, but the media and the government have certainly played no part in trying to alleviate its citizens and manage that fear in a healthy way.
Yeah. Danny, do you want to share a little about your experiences about like the fear, if there's a lot of fear on how,
Yeah, because I've only got 20% left on my phone, sorry. That's the worst thing. So I'll have to be quick. So for me, I've got a 21-year-old who's third year university. We're unvaccinated. I don't want my kids to be vaccinated, and I don't want to either. With that, they can't go to university. There's a lot of restrictions for them. Obviously for me as well, things that I don't care about. I don't care about the bars and the restaurants. It doesn't bother me. But I do care about not being able to see my children if they went into hospital. That bothers me. And that is a fear. That's a true fear of mine, that if my kids, something happens to them, then I can't be with them.
Yeah.
We had a friend that recently it was just before the 31st when the restrictions came in. She only had a week or two left for the birth of her baby, and they said to her, without the vaccine, she can't have her baby in the hospital that she was booked into. So she did go ahead, and sadly she lost the baby that day. So things like that are happening that are not what people don't know about, which is really sad. She got to go to the hospital for the miscarriage, but she wasn't allowed in to give birth to the baby.
Oh, yeah.
So there's some really dark things happening that we just don't, a lot of people don't know about.
So in the media, like, is it like, how is it portrayed? Like, is it, do they also talk about how it affects
what Rob said? It's
mental health, things like that, or is it, yeah?
Well, like Rob said, it is really a lot of fear that they're putting. My mum was in hospital a few weeks ago, and they gave her a test on depression. I lost my dad last year, and so my mum's not doing so well. So they gave her a test on depression, and it said things like, do you go out with your friends still? Do you go to the supermarket? Do you have any, do you resist doing these things? And she said, yes, I'm afraid of COVID. She said, that's not a depression test. That's a reality test, because I am afraid to go out. And, because she's terrified of catching COVID. So she stays in her house. She won't go to Woolworths. She won't do anything. So, and that comes from the media. Like, they announce, she'll say to me, there's this many cases today. So she is definitely afraid.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the difference is, because here the media portrays as well how many has been infected, how many is at the hospital, these kind of numbers. But because we have COVID around us, we know so many people who have had it, and we've seen how, most people had it, and people, I guess, they stay home and then they are fine. Most people, like, of course, there's older people that's at risk, but my parents, a lot of people I know are not afraid, because we know so many people that had it. So yeah, I think that's the difference. Even though you might hear it in news, you also see it in your community and in your, around you in society. Yeah. So you mentioned, Danny, are you still on, Danny? Okay, good. You mentioned about not
I
being
am.
able to
I
go
can
into,
hear you, but I can't see. You can't see me.
Okay, good. So you mentioned that you
I'm here.
You couldn't go into restaurants and bar. Is that because you have like a vaccine? Do you have vaccine mandate? So you have like Corona passport, or what's it called? Where you guys are.
So unless you're double vaccinated, you can't enter cafes, restaurants, bottle shops, alcohol. Although they've just changed that today, they now have changed that rule. Which is interesting. Hospitals, public libraries, museums, any things like that. There's quite a list of areas that you need to show a COVID passport that you've been double vaccinated to be able to go enter.
Does it count if you have been recovered from COVID? Is that recognized?
Yep. No.
So like if you previously...
No, it's not recognized. I actually have... No, it's not. Yesterday, actually, I was given a I don't know what it's called, a test to check if I had the antibodies. So it'll be very interesting to see what they do with that information.
Yeah.
Or if they look at it at all.
Yeah. And also can you get like a negative PCR test, and then that will count as well for some hours?
That doesn't count, no. They're looking at it at the universities at the moment, but they would have to do that negative PCR test on the day that they go to university. So each day they would have to show that negative test.
Yeah.
But it's still not.
At university, so they're not going to university at the moment, or they do school, like they do classes from home, or how does that work?
Everything's online.
All right.
Everything's online. You can go to university. All the labs and lectures are still running, but if you're not vaccinated, you can't. You can't enter the buildings because with your university card, you need to scan in. So you can't scan in if you don't have the COVID permission on there.
So here in Denmark, and I think most of the world, we heard a lot about how they've been locking down for a long time in Victoria and in Sydney. So you guys haven't been locked down much at all. How much have you got?
What do we have? We had 2 weeks right at the beginning, which was kind of reasonable because we didn't really know what it was at that stage. That seemed fair enough. People were prepared to do it. You know, we all ran out of toilet paper and everything else, and had to go and buy bum guns from the hardware shop. But then, you know, it was pretty. I think we opened up. The next lockdown that I recall was right before the state election. There was an apparent Delta infection in one of the hotels. And they said, oh, this thing, you know, everyone's going to get it. This guy's been all over the place. And it was right before an election, and they shut us down for 3 days or something over a long weekend. And the Premier had these beautiful pictures of his head on Superman's body floating around the internet. And he was the man. Seemed a little bit convenient to me, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. And in fact, even since then, I've struggled with you know, recently when people are saying, you know what, I'm not going to take the vaccines. They've lost their jobs. Some of it selling their homes and things like that. It's really rough. And for our Premier to be saying, well, you know, my job is to save lives and, you know, things like that. It's kind of a little bit heroic for me, especially given that there are plenty of people who, like was just mentioned, you know, a baby died. You know, there are people with cancers and other things that are really suffering. So I don't know. It's all a bit messed up, I think.
And how are people, like, you haven't been able to travel for 2 years? Like, how are people feeling about being, and also, like, I mean, between the states, like different states. So what if you had like an adult kid living in Sydney? Like, how, like, can you even see the relatives? Like, how does that work? How is that possible, or is that not possible at all?
We'll be able to see them in a few weeks.
All right. So the border policy is changing in a few weeks.
Yeah, apparently at the beginning of March.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You know, that that we've had these incredibly tight restrictions pretty much for nearly 2.5 years, over 2 years now. And then just as COVID's actually about to hit us, then they drop the borders, which to me seems like a real kind of inconsistency. But I think they're doing it, you know, obviously there's a lot of pressure on the state government. People are pretty fed up. I think that the majority of people are saying, well, that's just what we have to do. We have to suck it up. And if it means not seeing our family for a couple of years, then that's just the price we have to pay to protect our citizens. But there's certainly a lot of individual cases, and there've been some that have been highlighted in the media where people haven't been able to get back to loved ones, to see sick family members, to see dying relatives, and be a part of that. Yet at the same time, the government's able to continue the great Australian rules footy dream. And we've got players coming from interstate, in and out, playing with each other, playing a game. So all that must continue. But then you've got these other causes where, you know, I know part of my family's been affected by that, where, you know, my mother-in-law can't see her son and her grandkids. And I appreciate, there's a price we have to pay. But there's certainly a real hypocrisy in the way some things are allowed to continue and the way some things aren't. And that continues even with us at school, you know, having to wear the masks and to maintain some kind of social distancing and reduce all these events, but sport must go on. So students can sweat all over one another, pass bodily fluids and get changed in the change rooms, and 5 minutes later they're in a classroom and they've got to put their mask on. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be wearing masks, but there's just a real hypocrisy about the way this stuff is administered. And it's really difficult.
The sports activity, what about like choirs, like singing? Is that like locked down, or is that Is that?
The arts has really kind of suffered massively over the last couple of years. The Fringe Festival last year has been able to go ahead this year, but certainly there's restrictions upon it. Lots of music events which haven't happened, so local artists are obviously really struggling. Sport has managed to continue. So, I guess for the mainstream, for the majority of people, they're happy with that. But there's certainly people in sectors that raise questions, and when you raise questions, all of a sudden you get cast with all these aspersions on you, which is
just a right-wing Nazi.
Yeah.
For asking questions.
Yeah.
And you're selfish for wanting to be able to go to work. Talking about the hypocrisy, Rob, I recall one lengthy conversation on social media where somebody was calling all these people morons because they wanted to be able to go to work. And, I piped up and said something, and, the conversation continued, but it was all this stuff about, they're just selfish. They need to protect the rest of us. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. Who's being selfish here?
Yeah.
Am I selfish to say I'd really like to be able to work so I can feed my family and pay my mortgage? Or is the other person selfish for saying, well, you can't do that. I might get sick. It's ridiculous hypocrisy and double standards. I've really struggled with that. And I've also struggled with and the politicians have done it, and it's really, really been, a pretty prominent part of the rhetoric in lots of ways is just call everybody a Nazi if they ask a question. And I think some of that is going to wind back now after Canada's stuff in the last few days with Trudeau calling that Jewish lady a Nazi in Parliament. That didn't go down very well, and I actually think that's probably Mark's probably going to be doing some backpedaling after seeing the havoc that's kind of happening over there. I actually think things are going to settle down quite a lot in the next few weeks.
Yeah. So like here we definitely experience shops that's closed down. Is that like there's empty shop buildings and things? Do you experience that too?
There's lots of, like, even just go down into Fremantle, which is a major kind of precinct south of Perth here in Western Australia, relies heavily upon hospitality, restaurants and cafes. A lot of them are still open, but the streets, there's a lot of vacant buildings in Freo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what is that? If you didn't have many lockdown, like days of lockdown, what is that then? Is that why? Is that just because people are afraid to go out, or what causes that people then don't? Like they have to close down.
I don't really know.
If it was in Victoria or like Melbourne, because for so many days was locked down, I could see why there would be a lockdown, like why they have to close up like a shop because they didn't get any business.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are probably, at certain heightened times, are fearful to go out.
Yep.
And people are fearful to have anyone turn up at their shop.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a weird thing. I walked into a shop to buy something and I had cash, and she said, "We don't accept cash." Like, oh, okay, well, I'll go somewhere else then. That can't be good for business.
No.
None of it can be good for business. There are plenty of people who aren't double vaxxed. Yeah. We've got really high percentages that are, but there are people out there who are not double vaxxed. They can't go and eat anymore.
Yeah.
At a restaurant, they can't buy a drink at a bar. It's kind of crazy. And even, I don't know, I was thinking about this the other day. I think on the internet, you can get kind of riled up and you can have a fight with someone who you normally wouldn't have a fight with, right?
Yeah.
I think to a certain extent, just the wearing of masks distances us from each other. And so you know, at our local bottle shop, you know, the fella behind the counter is less friendly than he used to be, you know, and perhaps that's partly to do with, you know, show me your proof of vaccine and status and things like that. I don't know, but it just, yeah, just a lot of those, you know, visual cues and personal interactions and stuff are kind of pulled down a little bit. I think it's all kind of unhelpful at a social level.
And is any talk about that in media, about the whole situation about, you know, I guess also kids have to mask up in school, like how it is to not, you know, how does that affect people's mental health, I guess? Is there any talk in the media about that part of it or that side of it?
No, that's not really played up at all. You know, I think there's been a level of trying to protect students' anxieties and that impact it can have. So, for example, at school, students who are in the younger years, I think it's up to grade 5, I could be wrong, but essentially the junior school and the younger students don't have to wear masks because they understand the impact that it can have, and plus the need to be able to read. I beg your pardon?
The teachers, do they wear masks in front of the young? Or...
Yeah, so you have to wear a mask. However, to give instructions, you can pull it down just because it's muffled and it gets really hot. Obviously, talking straight into your mask.
But is that also in primary school, like the younger years, that the teacher wear a mask, or is that?
I'm not experienced in the junior school, so I can't really comment on that.
Yeah.
Hey, truly. Do the teachers have to wear masks at school? Yeah. Primary schools, they still wearing masks.
All right. Yeah.
Thanks, Truly.
Good to have a little assistance on the side. So has the vaccine mandate, has that affected you in regard to work, any of you, or how?
Yeah.
You go.
Me. Well, yeah. So for me personally, no. I had my vaccines, and that was a personal decision because I have other health problems, and I kind of was trying to hold off. I really wanted to wait until Novavax came out because I had more faith in it as a product. Yeah. But eventually the mandates came out. I need to keep my job. I had to get my shots, so I got them. But there are people at work who, you know, have lost their job and have put their house up on the market. And, you know, these are really terrible consequences for these people. And it was crazy because we had two things coming. We had Omicron, which some people were saying was kind of the vaccine we really need. And then we also had Novavax, which is a much... You know, a lot of those people would have taken Novavax. So he would have taken Novavax. And we could have had that here in Australia, you know, a month or two ago, and he wouldn't have had to lose his job. But we'd already purchased, you know, however many 100 millions of vaccines. And, you know, they went, nah, you got to do it. Novavax will come later. And so there's people all over the place who have lost their jobs. So in the teaching industry, there's schools are finding it very, very hard to find staff. There's massive shortages of staff. You've got people teaching stuff that they might not really be best qualified to teach. And you've got students who had teachers last year and don't have teachers this year. And they're waiting to find a teacher.
So then the Novavax, that's because it's building on like the traditional technology that we know of a vaccine. That's it, right? Yeah,
it's just been around longer, and so I know lots and lots of people who are very scared of the mRNA vaccines and basically are saying, no, I really just want to take this one, and they should be allowed to make that choice. I think anyway. You know, there are plenty of people. Well, in our office, you know, there's one guy who had heart problems, and then somebody else had heart problems, his sister or something, and a woman at work, her sister got raced off to hospital in an ambulance after having a shot. And, you know, there's too many things close to home. We don't see reports of it, of this stuff. You know, I got shingles after my first shot, and, you know, I jumped online to see if anyone else got shingles after their shot. It turned out lots and lots of people do, but the experts ridicule us and say, oh, you can't get shingles, that's the chickenpox virus. It's like, well, we all know that, but it's reactivated, apparently, for some people. Their immune system gets knocked around and they get shingles. So it doesn't manifest all the time. So just having those things acknowledged. When they're not acknowledged, it creates mistrust. So that, to me, that's why so many people don't trust, you know, some of the new technology, and don't trust kind of our governments, because they've been saying lots of things which we go, really? Yeah. Recording stopped.
Oh, we're still live. Yeah.
Oh.
Danny, do we still have you on?
No, she's not there.
Okay. Rob, how has it affected you on work?
Well, me personally at work, it hasn't affected me too much. I've got to say, there's on the back of what Owen said, there's a pretty ugly discourse that sits around the vaccinations, where I think a lot of people automatically assume that because you might be not necessarily ready to jump in to get a vaccine without asking questions, then you're willing to sacrifice the community, and not by putting your own needs and interests first.
Yep.
Which is really unfortunate, because it actually breeds this thing about, so if you are hesitant or if you're asking questions, then you're an anti-vaxxer. And all of a sudden, if you're labelled as an anti-vaxxer, then you're also most likely a conspiracy theorist and a right-wing extremist. And it just gets lumped on you like that. And there's really good cause, I think, for hesitancy with these vaccinations that came out. I was happy to get vaccinated. Well, you know, I would have preferred to have gotten Novavax. I believe that, you know, vaccinations is a personal choice. So to have it mandated and to negate choice is really problematic, especially when you don't understand people's motivations and situations behind them. So, for example, I'll just talk about Cindy, my wife's situation.
Yep.
Has an autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's, is a bit like the canary in the coal mine, often reacts to things quite easily, skin rashes and what have you. So I was really quite anxious about what the impact and the effects of the vaccine might have. Did her own kind of research on looking at the options that were available, and there was only 3 available in Australia. You've either got Moderna, Pfizer, or AstraZeneca. At a time when most people were advising in the mainstream against AstraZeneca, that's the one that she felt was best for her situation. And she got a bad reaction. These welts all over her torso, all over her neck, all up and down her arms, highly itchy, couldn't sleep at night, just wanted to scratch her skin away. This happened within 3 days of the vaccination, of getting the first jab.
Yeah.
And then went to the doctors, no cause and effect. Can't have anything to do with the vaccination. Goes away, comes back a couple of weeks later, sees another doctor, no cause and effect. So there's people in the medical fraternity, for whatever reason, are unwilling to try and find those linkages and support them as patients. So she works in the health system, so unless she gets her second vaccination, she has to step down from her job. And it's a job that she loves doing. But she also has to weigh up her own personal health. So she applied for exemptions. She was put on the waiting list. So finally got to see a doctor, and the doctor said, okay, I think you need to see an immunologist. And there's a 4-month waiting list to see immunologists. Apparently immunologists are totally overrun, largely due to the vaccine rollout. But that's certainly not in the mainstream media.
No.
And we talked to other medical specialists, and they're saying there are a lot of people who are having reactions and problems with their hearts, with their muscles, skin irritations as a response to the vaccinations. But they don't account for an exemption unless you are deemed it's a risk to your life, you know. So Cindy's got this situation where basically goes to the immunologist says, oh, okay, you've got chronic urticaria. So this is a response to the vaccination. If you have a second vaccination, you are likely to get another response. It may be for a year. There are some people who have it for a lifetime.
Yeah.
However, they can't write her an exemption. So when you then start to look at that against the current risk of Omicron, where we've currently got 800 cases in Perth, 0 cases in hospital, we completely understand Delta's a different story. But when we start to look at, the effect of, or the measures that are in place against the risks that can occur, why wouldn't you give someone an exemption knowing they might be going into this lifelong response? Just seems so out of proportion.
Yeah.
And that's only one story because I know it. And so, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are in similar situations.
Yeah.
But certainly don't hear about them. The numbers probably don't get recorded. There's statistics that aren't in the media or aren't available.
Well, the statistics have been bent from the beginning, haven't they? I mean, we were all saying things like, hang on a minute, that guy got killed in a motorbike accident, but it got recorded as a COVID death. And, you know, things like that happened very early on. And while alarm bells were going off for lots of us, we were told to shut up and be quiet. And, you know, you're a Nazi. And it's like very, very weird way of thinking.
Yeah. Like I think the media has a responsibility, and the government has a responsibility with all of this. So if you're going to give mandates, you need to come forth with information.
Yes.
So we're going to, you know, we know that the case in America where the FDA has tried to put a 75-year hold on the data and the information coming out against Pfizer. So how can you have and support a mandate without having an open book on the information that's available?
Yeah.
So there is either a problem or a risk with the vaccination, or there's not. And if there's not, then you provide the information.
Yeah.
And again, like I said before, the unfortunate thing is if you raise that as a red flag, the discourse that happens locally and on the internet is you're a conspiracy theorist, trust the science. Well, that doesn't cut it, you know, because the science currently says that Omicron is low risk. The science says that over 90% of people who have died with COVID have died with COVID, not of COVID.
Yeah.
And that's not to deny those people who have died with COVID that this is an awful thing. You know, I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And so in acknowledging there's a problem with the mandates, I in no way kind of want to take away and diminish, you know, the tragedies that's occurred to to people and to their losses and to the impact on their lives. But if you're going to be fed information, you need to be fed the information, and it's really sadly lacking.
And maybe also the responsibility of, if somebody do get injured by the vaccine, take the responsibility and help these people out, get them through the system so they can help and feel better. Like, I mean, that's also taking responsibility of, you know, those mandates.
Yeah. And I can only talk from my personal experience, but it is absolutely clear from my experience with what's happened to Cindy, there is an agenda to downplay any effects of vaccines. You know, a doctor is there to support the patient. So if a patient comes with a problem, you try and find cause and effect. And if you go to an immunologist and an immunologist acknowledges that you've got this chronic response to it, you support your patient. And they're basically saying, well, you go on and you continue, and you're just going to have to learn to live with it.
Yeah.
That's a real failing of the system.
Yeah.
Yes, and doctors, though, are operating under a system where they run the risk of losing a license if they prescribe this, or, you know, what they genuinely think they should be prescribing. I mean that kind of stuff is insane. From the beginning of all of this, I was shocked that nobody was talking about treatments. It was like, we need a vaccine, we need a vaccine. They invented a vaccine. And anybody anywhere along the way, if they talked about treatments, got poo-pooed and was, you know, basically ostracized. They called, you know, ivermectin a horse drug. Why would you do that for about a drug that's been used, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of times on people for decades? And in fact, I read an article just the other day from University of Sydney. You know, that's one of our world universities, a world ranked university. And the article was saying that we really have no information about how humans would react to ivermectin. You know, I mean, you know, I'm not saying ivermectin is necessarily the answer, but that is false information straight up from our best university. It's like, if they can't tell you what side effects you don't get from ivermectin, nobody can. It's insane. Yeah,
and as far as I know, the ones that invented ivermectin got a Nobel Prize for it. So I guess it must have been, you know, recognized in some way.
Yes.
And so I just want to bring it back to Cindy's case.
Yeah.
And the notion of a mandate and how that mandate gets administered. So she has to decide within the next week whether or not she's going to have a vaccination to go to work. And if she doesn't have it, then she gets stepped down.
Yep.
So she has said, based on the information from the immunologist and her response to the first vaccination from AstraZeneca, and wanting to steer away from the mRNA technology, that's a personal choice. Novavax is available. However, the people that administer the vaccination have said, no, you can't have the Novavax because you didn't have it for your first shot.
Aye.
So, yeah. It's a really diabolical situation, and you know, I just got to wonder how many more people are there, that are sitting in those shoes. You know, there's a solution if the vaccination mandate was so imperative to save everybody's lives. And they know that you can mix vaccinations. Everybody is having, you know, a different one for their booster. There's been mixes and matches of first shot, second shot, third shots. Now that this is available, yet they're saying you can't take it.
Yeah.
Because they got a rule.
It's obscene.
Mm.
Yep.
And then you question it and you're an anti-vaxxer. And that's a preposterous response.
Yep.
Like ideologically, it's just idiotic. But unfortunately, I think that's the way that the media has framed a lot of people to think. You know, you're either in it and you swallow the pill and do it without questioning. And if you question it, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
Now, these are intelligent people, you know, who have got degrees, work professionally, build their practice on the notion of trying to encourage people to ask questions. And as soon as you ask a question about something that's really important, then you're either a right-wing extremist or a loony.
So is there any jobs that you can actually do without being vaccinated in Western Australia, or what's
Yeah, they're probably getting fewer and fewer. One would hope that, you know, the international narrative has changed, and it's even changing a little bit in the eastern states in terms of course, you know, there was a pro-vaccine mandate, and maybe that made sense given the Delta virus and the first round of COVID-19, and when there were so many unknowns. But I think once you track the history of it and the course of the virus, and you see the impact that Omicron has had, that's where international countries are starting to peel back their mandates. And that narrative is even starting to change here in Australia. But I don't think it's unlikely to peel back anytime soon here in Western Australia, certainly not with the style of leadership that has currently been displayed. They've got to stand by their guns because they've done so much to this point to protect us.
Yeah.
The mandate is the only way to continue that. Yeah, but back to your question. So there are lots of occupations where you don't have to have a vaccination. But certainly in the education sector, the health sector, the hospitality sector, yeah, and anywhere where there's large groups of people working together. Yeah. I think the trade industries, building industry is certainly hit by the mandates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in Denmark, we dropped all restrictions more or less from one day to the other, during where we have like really high cases of Omicron. Do you think anything could, you think that could be, is that are they talking about that in Western Australia about dropping restrictions? And
well, Marky Mark has pretty much has already alluded to the fact that this is the new norm. You know, so now it's 2 shots to meet the mandates, the requirements of the mandates. But it's now in place that within a certain time frame, within 3 months of having your second shot, you've got to have your third. So you've got to have your booster. I'd say there's growingly a sense of frustration amongst people because they've been fed one story and the goalposts have changed. We're at 95%. So you think, well, we're at 95%. First dose, second dose vaccinations. Surely the risk there with Omicron coming is suffice. But they're now saying you've got to have a third shot. And the new norm is that you will probably have shots every 3 to 4 months thereafter. And that's just to keep your vaccine passport certificate up to date. So if it's not up to date, then you can't participate and function in a lot of society. Yeah, it's pretty gross.
Yeah. You also,
that's horrendous.
You also mentioned about, being talked about as being a conspiracy theorist or tinfoil hat or whatever. Why do you think this concept has become so common during the COVID crisis? I mean,
yeah, good question. I think
mentioned a lot.
It's hard to know. Like, I mean, it's probably wrapped up in. I guess the narrative that's happened over the course of the last couple of decades, where we're having to make major decisions about the world and the environment, and we've got to trust the science, and rightly so. And so then when you have something like vaccines, the science says vaccines work, and so rightly so. However, many of those have had years and years of testing. And so now we're sort of going, we have to trust the science, but we don't really know what the science has to offer.
Yeah.
So we want you to vaccinate not just yourselves, but your children, not really knowing what the risk is. We reckon the risk is really low. So the betting is just have the vaccine and you'll be fine. And we reckon you'll be fine.
Yeah.
And there's a lot hinging on that, you know, because when you look at that and that narrative then over the last 2 years, when Pfizer first came out, it was a 95, 94%, whatever, high 90s efficacy rate. And that was the vaccine that was going to fix us.
Yeah.
And then very soon after that, we learn, well, the efficacy doesn't actually last very long. So that in itself tells us that the science is wrong.
Yeah.
You know, that the science needs to be questioned. And so now all of a sudden, here we are, we've had 2 shots, because you have to have your second shot, because that is going to improve the efficacy and that will sustain and see us through the Delta virus. And then all of a sudden, 6 months after having 2 shots, we're down to an efficacy of below 40% or something. So we have to have the 3rd shot to bring our efficacy rate back up.
Yeah.
So whilst on one hand, we're being told to trust the science, we understand it's unprecedented times and we don't, you know, we have to just trust that what he's doing is right and that there is not going to be any long-term effects for it. But it certainly doesn't put a lot of faith, well, me personally, put a lot of faith in the science when it's so wrong.
Well, yeah, and actual science says if you get Omicron, you're going to be pretty well immune to getting, you know, COVID-19 for a while. But they're still telling us here that you within a week or something, you've got to go and have another shot. And it's like, well, I mean, you've got the very best immune, you know, system to deal with COVID-19, and they're going to make you have a shot. That's not science. It's not science.
And then you ask the question on top of that: why do I have to have a 3rd shot when I've got natural immunity?
That's right. Yeah. And that's not science. Their answer to that isn't science. None of it is science. That's the bit that, and to me, that's why they have to keep calling people, you know, right-wing extremists and all of that stuff. To me, it's all connected with you know, the identity politics of the last kind of, you know, a few decades. I think we've just slipped into a real tribal kind of us and them mentality, and people, and we've got the internet where we can get angry with each other much more easily. And yeah, it's just it's a bit of a social mess, I think, in lots of ways.
Yeah.
But I think people are seeing through it this time, because suddenly they've actually got to go out and have a shot, and people are going, well, I'm not a right-wing extremist, but they're calling me that.
Yeah.
Weird, isn't it?
I'm just gonna hear if anybody watching live that has any questions for our guests here. So if anybody have questions, please put them in the comments, and we will ask Owen and Rob your questions. Yep. I have something while we wait for. So what do you think about this authoritarian way of forcing people to take medicines? Do you have trust in your government? Like you kind of mentioned a little about, you know, I guess about how the efficacy of the vaccine was so high and they keep on just dropping it. And like, I mean, I guess that will create some, you know, dent in the trust of the government.
My trust has fallen a great deal, and probably just because of the the misinformation that the government and the media and universities even have put out there. You know, that, and the fact that it's become they refuse to let us talk about some things, and they insist that we believe other things that are not correct. You know, that for a while they were telling us you shouldn't wear face masks, they don't work. And then they said, you've got to wear face masks because they work real well. And then they say, well, we told you that in the beginning because we didn't want you to get face masks because we wanted the, you know, frontline workers to get them. And it's like, so they lied to us but it was a good lie. You know, it's, I don't know, it doesn't instill trust at all.
No.
Yeah.
How much news do you get from Europe? Like, what do you hear about Europe when you're in the news about COVID? Like, what's...
Well, you know, I've been sort of tracking what's happening in England more so than in Europe. But I guess, you know, seeing just recently, you know, knowing that Denmark has dropped its mandates and that Sweden has as well, I just hope that here in Western Australia, I guess as the course of the Omicron virus plays out, that there's a bit of balance to how they kind of rule with the mandates. You know, everybody has played their part. At least 95% of the population has had the vaccinations, has done what they've been told to do. And if the threat of death from, because you know, the weird thing is people keep saying, oh yeah, but the polio vaccines work. Polio and Omicron are two very different things, and to even throw them into the same sentence is ludicrous.
Yeah.
And these are often very intelligent people that actually that raise this as an issue, you know, or say that, well, are you willing to actually risk the community? Like, I mean, far out. You know, it doesn't take much intellectual rigor to ask a couple of questions and put some holes through some of the arguments that are presented. So you'd hope that some of these questions that people have been asking over the last couple of years, the answers might start coming to light over the next, you know, 5 to 10, 20 years, who knows how long. But certainly you'd reckon that the mandates would have to get peeled back.
Has there been any reaction to, like, Denmark and Sweden and UK dropping the restrictions? Like, have you heard any of your politicians speak out about commenting on that, or have the press asked questions about it?
No, the politicians kind of stay away from it. They're driving their own narrative. Certainly, I would say mainstream media in Australia is starting to shift. I would say that's been happening over the last couple of months. Certainly, you know, I guess Murdoch News and his narrative is changing things, and he's got the monopoly on media ownership in Australia. So, yeah, it's hard to know. And I guess that plays into the hands of, you know, people who then see anyone who opposes the mandates as a right-wing person because it's coming out in some right-wing media.
Yeah. There's also a question about Cindy. If it says that, Rob, does your wife have a possibility to change line of work? So does she have to jab to work?
There's always the possibility of changing work. I don't want to say anything that might risk her current employment. She's currently in a process with the WA Health Department.
Yep.
And that's got to play out over the next week. But certainly, yeah, I guess anyone she has the right to change course of job. It just means that if she can't get exempt, well, it's already been stipulated that she can't be exempt from having any further vaccinations. So she's just got to choose either to swallow that pill and have a vaccine, or or not. And if she doesn't, then she's got to find a line of work where the vaccine mandate doesn't apply.
Yeah.
Small business, that's an option, you know, other circles, yeah.
I also have a question that says, do you listen to alternative media from Australia? What are the best channels? I guess.
Is that for music or for the news?
I guess that's from the news. If you want to know about the COVID situation and yeah. I guess somebody have a recommendation.
Well, I guess in Australia, in terms of mainstream, you know, we're pretty much stuck by our commercial and non-commercial broadcasters. If we're watching the television and the internet, of course, there's a wider variety. So there are some independent, there's some, you know, obviously citizen journalism and some independent media who are reporting stuff. I guess, again, some of those are automatically going to get labelled as right-wing simply because they're posing questions or portraying information differently. Unfortunately, that's the sad thing about the national discourse and media and things with these issues in Australia at the moment, is as soon as you present yourself outside the mainstream, instead of traditionally you would be called a left wing, you know, you would be right. You would be a left wing lunatic, and now you're a right wing fascist. It really is quite an obscurity.
Yeah.
It's completely flipped, hasn't it? I mean, you know, to me, all these people being called right-wing, you know, extremists, they're doing the stuff that the left wing used to do. They've taken the baton and run with it in lots of ways. I just, looking at a news article today in Australia, the hysterical headlines have receded. Hospitalizations and intensive care numbers are less than half what they were, having never reached predicted thresholds. So that's mainstream media today. I think it's all gonna, you know, the narrative's gonna swing fairly quickly, and I reckon there'll be some politicians' heads on chopping blocks in a fairly short time, and you know, hopefully it'll actually go away. Pretty soon.
Is there any?
After we have a.
Oh,
sorry, go.
Is there any? They have another question that says, "Is there any convoy truckers demonstrating in Australia?"
Not quite like Ottawa.
Okay.
But certainly,
there were over in Canberra.
In Canberra, yeah.
Yep.
And was that just
Don't know much about it.
Was it a day, or was that like, are they still there, or what's their agenda? What were they?
I think they call themselves like a freedom rally.
They want mandates dropped, or they want restrictions dropped, or yeah.
Yeah, I think essentially they're looking for a dropping of mandates. Yeah, because as soon as you drop the mandates, you've got the restrictions lifted.
Yeah.
Yes.
So people's jobs can be secured. People can go back to work. Yeah.
And how were they portrayed in the media? Did you have to find like your own YouTube videos of it, or was there actually any?
Yeah, it's generally there's not much of a spotlight in it in the mainstream media. Certainly you can find it on the internet when you start looking for it. It's, again, in the mainstream media, it's often reported as right wing.
Yep.
Yeah. As a convoy of anti-vaxxers from across Australia descending on the lawns of Parliament with a vague mission to take down the government.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, they're nasty, aren't they?
Yeah, these like regular people. Yeah, like I mean.
Yeah, like regular people, just yes.
And they've been reported, you know, I guess, you know, from the outset, obviously Victoria had much more stringent policies than we had here in Western Australia to start with, and any demonstration was reported as violent.
Yeah. That's
and I think if you actually interrogate any of that footage, it's pretty clear that the violence came from the police more often than not. And if there was violence coming from the protesters, it was a very small minority. So the media certainly handpicked isolated incidents, and that's what made the headlines. Yeah.
Is there any regular freedom movement in the Western Australia? Like, is there like somebody having rallies?
Yeah, there's been rallies.
Events going on. Yeah.
I think there was one last week. There's been quite a few rallies in the city, ranging from a few thousands to probably tens of thousands of people. Again, depending on where you source your information, where you look to, those numbers are reported differently in the media. So it's certainly they played down the numbers as much as possible. Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to say thank you so much that you took your time to answer some of our questions and tell us a little about how life and work is in Western Australia. It's nice.
Well, thanks very much for having us, Dina.
Thanks for having us.
News. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Hopefully next time you do something like this with us, we'll be on the other side of it all. And
Well, it'd be interesting to have an after Omicron chat, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Maybe some movement, and we can, actually.
Yes. Well, look, one of my best friends just moved to Indonesia, and he said, "I can't believe I'm going to Indonesia because I think the people are more sensible there these days." And it was all this stuff.
Yeah.
He said, so he arrived with his wife just at the beginning of the rise of Omicron, and he sent me a message yesterday saying, "I think I've got it." And they've both been quite sick, and he'd gone and bought himself some ivermectin over the counter. He took his first one. A couple of hours later, he said, "I'm feeling better already," and he reckons he's over it today, basically. So there you go. Hopefully it'll only be like that for the rest of us.
In this room, with us sitting here in this room, we have it too. So it's
really,
and we know a lot of people that have had it.
And you're still with us.
Most people have had it, so yeah.
Yes. So in Perth, most of us don't know anyone who's had it, except for people like you in other countries and other states.
Yes.
We've been very isolated, but anyway, it's going to be an interesting month ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again, and have I guess it's nighttime, isn't it? Evening, nighttime. Yeah. Time to relax.
Thanks.
Have
so
a
much for
great
having
day.
us.
You too.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Bye.